Okay, here we go with another episode of Existential Ambiguity, a review of the Buddha's teaching and the ambiguity of existence by R.G.D.S. Wetimuni. And this episode is going to be very heavily context dependent. So if you haven't seen the last few episodes, it would be good to go back and review them, especially beginning from chapter 5 onward. So you can download the PDF and read the whole book if you like. We're still going through chapter 5, the 5 clinging aggregates. And now we're going to talk about matter and clinging, to pick up where we left off last time. The Buddha defines matter as follows. And what, monks, is matter? The 4 primary modes of behavior, and the matter that is by holding, clinging to the 4 primary modes of behavior. This, monks, is matter. So, in other words, matter in the Buddha's system is not only the material substances themselves, the 4 categories of water, earth, air, and fire, but these are not defined by their chemical properties or their physical properties. They are defined by their resistance and their behavior. And because we cling to them, we meaning putujanas, which is pretty much everybody on this planet, there's another mode of existence of matter comes into being by our clinging, our tanha, our holding to it, thinking of it as I and mine. So to the Buddha, both of these definitions of matter are valid and important. It's not only what it is, it's how we look at it. This is the insight of the Buddha's teaching that so far has eluded Western science completely. I don't know what's in people's minds when they say that the teaching of the Buddha and Western science are in agreement. I don't really see a whole lot of agreement, because the Buddha, yes, he's following phenomenology, the scientific method of observation, making an hypothesis, and then following up by experiment. But that's where all the similarity ends. What the Buddha is doing is he's validating the existence of the observer. And modern science tries to get rid of the observer as far as possible, make the observer impersonal, and certainly denies the validity of subjective experience. Whereas the Buddha is saying subjective experience is all there is. Even in a scientific lab, where all the experiments are monitored by instruments. I used to actually work for Hewlett-Packard back in the days when mostly what they made was scientific instruments. And I used to calibrate those instruments. I used to go out to the labs and meet with the scientists and calibrate the instruments they use for making experiments. And the thing about it is, eventually, somebody has to read those instruments, has to evaluate that data. And depending on their point of view, they will introduce different assumptions into the data and the interpretation. They can't help it. If you're looking for a certain result, you're going to try to see that result. You're going to try to find what you're looking for. After all, that is what makes a scientist's career. When they make a theory, say, I think that so-and-so is going to happen when you bombard this material with electrons or whatever. And then they're able to measure it and say, yes, that's what happened. And the other nasty little secret of science is that they're past a certain point, there is no repeatability of experimental results. In other words, let's say you bombard metallic sodium with hydrogen ions or whatever, and then you measure the results. Well, the results are going to form some kind of curve. They're not going to be strictly one result. There's going to be a result, a different result, every time you perform the measurement. That's what calibration is all about. Calibration of an instrument gives you the standard by which everything is going to be measured. That's a nice theory, but in actual practice, every single measurement is different. And you're going to have some kind of bell-shaped curve with a large majority of the results within a certain range, and then there's going to be outliers beyond that. That's just the way it is. Nothing is certain in this world. Nothing is absolute. It all depends on how you look at it, how you measure it, and then how you interpret the results. So he goes on to say, matter is taken in two senses in this definition. First, in the fundamental sense, and second, in the everyday sense that the Putujana's existence is concerned with. In the fundamental sense, matter is the four primary modes of behavior, designated as earthy or solid, watery or cohesive, fiery or ripening, and airy or moving. They are also called the earth element, water element, fire element, and air element. So when we say an element here, we're not using the word in the same connotation as the scientist. The scientist wants to find what is the most irreducible substance that still has the same properties. So he's trying to take samples of things that are found in nature and then reduce them until there's only one kind of substance there. That's not what we're talking about here at all. What we're talking about here is a kind of behavior, a kind of phenomenon that is perceived and cognized by our senses in a particular way. Let's go on. He makes that clear further on. The word dhatu, translated as element, is not used in the sense of a fundamental ingredient or irreducible substance. It is used in the same sense as in the phrase a good element or the justifiable element, a part or aspect of something abstract, especially one that is essential or characteristic. Oxford Dictionary. So when we say there's a bad element in the neighborhood, that is the same definition of element that we're using here in the context of the Buddhist teaching. So an element is not exactly an irreducible substance. The tendency of science to try to make elements out of everything is called elementalism. So anything that you can name, anything that has a symbol or a label or designation attached to it, can be viewed as an element. Some scientists want to elementalize consciousness. But consciousness isn't a thing. Consciousness is a process. And it requires the existence of a subjective being. We've even tried to elementalize that as the soul. But actually and in fact, elementalism is a wrong approach to life in general, because nothing whatsoever is of importance or consequence unless it is viewed, experienced, and cognized by a living entity. Only then does it begin to have meaning and value. Otherwise, it's not important. Now, Venerable Sariputta says that a pile of wood, which to the normal individual would be composed only of the earth element, could be perceived by the developed individual as composed of any one of the four elements, or as the beautiful or ugly element. He says, friend, a monk who has one supernormal mental power can, if he wishes, view that pile of wood as earth. Well, what is the reason for that? The earth element is in that pile of wood. Hence, the monk who has one supernormal mental power can view that pile of wood as earth. However, a monk who has one supernormal mental power can, if he wishes, view that pile of wood as water, as fire, as air, as beautiful, as ugly. What is the reason for that? The ugly element is in that pile of wood. Hence, the monk who has one supernormal mental power can view that pile of wood as ugly. In other words, what something is, what its fundamental nature or character or quality is, depends on how we look at it. The Buddha said in one sutta that there are beings, there are devas, who perceive space as earth. So this is a supernormal mental power. This is a mentality that's higher than the human. That you can actually look at something in a different way and see it in a completely different way. If we look at a pile of wood, there's a pile of wood right outside the window here. If you look at it as earth, then you're seeing that, well, the tree sprouted from the earth, draws its nourishment from the earth, and it exhibits most of the properties of earth. And then when it falls, if we don't make it into something, then it goes back into the earth. And even if we do turn it into lumber and use it to build something, eventually it goes back to the earth. So we can say that the wood is mostly earth and identify it as earth. But wait a minute. If you watch a tree grow over time, as in time-lapse photography, for example, you can see that it actually flows in a certain way. And inside the wood there's a sap that moves and the water that it draws from the ground. And if you know all these things about trees, you could start to see trees or wood as water. They actually have a certain flowing mechanism to them. And the same with air. You could see a tree as air because it waves its branches around and leaves around in the wind. And in that way it behaves like air sometimes. So the point is, what the basic or essential nature of an object is really depends on how we look at it. And the more mental power we have over our point of view, the more different ways that we can see the things that are in front of us. I'll give you a good example. An ordinary person, a patujana, someone who is chasing the pleasures of the senses and thinks that's the highest thing in life. If they see a beautiful woman in front of them, they're going to be like, oh wow, this is great, and they're going to relish and be attracted to that beautiful woman with all their being. Now, if a monk sees the same beautiful woman, he's going to avert his eyes. Why? Because he doesn't want to invoke the limbic programming in his brain that makes him desire to mate with this woman. He does not want to get into that state of mind. He wants to remain detached. He wants to remain neutral. He wants to be dispassionate, not passionate. He wants to be unattached, not attached. He wants to be concentrated, not scattered all over the universe, seeking out objects of beauty and becoming attached to them when he finds them. Why? Because the pleasure that is derived from meditation is far longer lasting and reliable than the pleasure derived from passion. Passion means the energetic pursuit and enjoyment of the objects of the senses. If one is passionate for something, it means that he puts a lot of energy into obtaining it and using it for his delight. He identifies very strongly with it, and he builds his I off of it. Like some people really passionate about cars, and their whole identity is tied up with cars. What kind of car do they drive? And what kind of performance does it give? And so on and so forth. Some people are the same way about, music or movies or whatever, some sense object that they identify strongly with, and they see it as an actual part of their identity. Oh, I'm a heavy metal fan. Well, I'm a jazz fan, man. So there are different types of identity based on different identifications with material objects because these people are passionate about them. But the monk doesn't want this kind of identification. The monk wants to be removed from all of that. In fact, the monk ultimately wants to stop perception and non-perception altogether. Because that is where the deepest, most profound, most reliable, and most intense pleasure is to be found. And that pleasure is far longer lasting than the pleasure of sense objects. Sense objects are over in a few minutes. Even the highest sense pleasure of sex life is just over in a few minutes, and then you don't have any attraction to it anymore. But the pleasure derived from meditation can go on for hours, even days. But to experience that pleasure, one has to be free from passion, free from attachment, free from identification with matter. To become free from this identification with matter, one has to understand what matter is, not in and of itself, but in relation to one's perception. So, of course, what we've been going over again and again is that matter is a type of behavior. Okay, the table has a different kind of behavior than the chair. So we recognize it as a table, and we recognize the chair as a chair. Because the table is good for putting stuff on, and the chair is good for sitting. Now imagine if someone comes with an axe and chops up the table and chair and puts all the wood in a pile. Now, where's the table and chair? It's the same wood, the same material, the same scientific element, but now it's not good anymore as a table, not recognizable anymore as a chair. So we don't think of it as a chair. We don't recognize it as a chair or table. We say, that's just a pile of chopped up wood. Throw it in the fire. Our recognition of these different elements is based on its behavior. But let's go on, because he clarifies this in the next paragraph. This gives an indication of the meaning of dhatu, which we render as element. It also confirms that for an element of behavior to exist as that element or behavior, it must be cognized. The suttas speak of other elements too, such as the space element, akasha dhatu, consciousness element, vijnana dhatu, the pleasure element, sukha dhatu, and so on. So is this elementalism? No. And the reason why is that it's a form of behavior of matter. I mean, I could say the table dhatu or the chair dhatu, because the table has the element of tableness. It has the behavior of a table. The chair has the behavior of a chair. But we can't take something that is not amenable to that behavior, let's say a pile of gravel, and say that's a chair. You can sit on it, but it's pretty uncomfortable. And it's not much good for putting stuff on either, so we couldn't call it a table either. What really is an element? What is a dhatu? It's a type of behavior that allows us to recognize and interact with it in a certain pattern of behavior. There's a quote from the Buddha. Monks, the four primary modes are the cause. The four primary modes are the condition for the manifestation of the aggregate of matter. So now we come full circle back to the original topic here, which is the aggregate of matter, the sense objects of matter, as opposed to the first dhatu, or the first aggregate was the aggregate of consciousness. Now we're talking about the aggregate of matter. So what is it about the aggregate of matter? That it has these four modes of behavior in general. The fact that we cling to these things, the fact that we cognize them, recognize them, and then make them a part of our identity, a part of our being, a part of a process of becoming, is what causes them to be a problem for us. Because if we cling to them, then we want to keep them, but we can't keep them forever. They slip away in time. That causes suffering. If we want to be able to overcome our attachment, our identification, and so on with matter, first we have to recognize the structure of that identification. We have to be able to parse the mental functions that create that identification so that we can recognize them and stop them. It's a very simple thing, but it requires an elaborate exploration and discussion of the properties of matter and the experience of matter to be able to let go of it. Because basically we have to understand the anatomy of the trap that we're in. We're in a type of existence that makes suffering mandatory because that existence is based on matter. Matter develops through certain stages. We talked about this earlier, 7 stages, and which are part of the process of dependent origination. And so we cling to this matter, and that creates our experience of it. Unless we cling to it, unless we make it a part of our being, it can't cause the suffering. The reason we're suffering is not that matter exists. Matter by itself is no problem, but the fact that we cling to it. As soon as we begin this clinging process, that's when all our troubles begin. Now, the most important or significant aggregate of the 4 primary modes in the everyday sense, the most important lump of matter for the individual and described as internal to him would be this body. The Buddha describes it. This material body is made up of the 4 fundamental modes. The biggest attachment that we have is to this body. Most people know only life through this body. They don't know anything beyond. They haven't progressed enough in the meditation to experience anything beyond this body. They don't even know how to get out of this body. They're more or less trapped in this body, which is composed of 4 different modes. Okay, earth, water, fire, and air. So until we can recognize these modes, until we can analyze them, until we can see how we're clinging to them, it's really impossible for us to let go of them. Impossible for us to stop our attachment and our identification with this body. But we must do that if we're going to reach the higher stages of meditation. In the beginning of meditation, of course, we start with the body. The body has many different parts, and we should go through and become aware of all of those parts systematically so that we develop a clear awareness of all the states of the different parts of the body. And if there's anything wrong, if there's any pain or resistance or lack of transparency to the energy, then we have to solve that. That way we stay in a good, healthy relationship with our body. But more than that, we get to see which parts of the body are composed of earth, water, fire, and air. And then we get to regulate those for optimal health. The whole science of Ayurveda, very detailed science, is based on this principle. So the material body is made up of the 4 modes: earth, water, fire, and air. And we cling to this body harder than we cling to anything else. If we can relax our clinging to this body, our identification with this body, then many things become possible. And the first step of that, of course, is recognizing the different states of matter, the different behaviors of the different parts of the body. In relation to the Putujana's experience, it is understood to be not just this body, but this my body. Being, then, something held or clung to, it is something that exists by clinging, upadaya. because then it would be something considered as for me or mine. In this way, the matter that is by holding the four primary modes of behavior is the Putujana's body, described as internal, which he considers as I and mine, together with whatever external material objects he so considers. Well, this is pretty clear, pretty straightforward. We've actually been leading up to this. The body is an aggregate. Matter is an aggregate. And an aggregate, remember, is a bunch of things, a set of things, a group of things that are grouped together by some common principle or identity. And what is it in this case? In the case of the body is viewed as I and mine. It's not just this body, it's this my body. And I'm tremendously attached. Every Putujana is tremendously attached to this body. If any little thing is wrong, then, it's like, makes his day. So what are we trying to do in meditation? One of the first things we're trying to do is to get rid of this idea that the body is me, that the body is even mine. We're trying to see that this body arises by various causes in nature, more or less by itself. And we're in this body, we're identified with this body because of our past karma. We could be in any other body. If our karma was the proper type for that body, we would be there. If we were going to be a famous artist or a movie star or musician or something like that, we would have had the karma for it. We would have been born into that kind of body. But instead we're born into this body because that's the karma we have. That's the only connection. This body is not special. It's just like every other body. It's conceived, and then it's gestated, then it's born, it grows, it produces some byproducts, it withers, and then it dies. These 7 stages. Everybody goes through those same 7 stages. There's nothing unique about this body versus that body, except the karma that you bring to it. And that is your karma because you identify with its results. You say, yes, this is my body. That means I identify with the body. I think of it as I and mine. Because of that, I becomes the address that all that karma is delivered to. Because I is the stamp that we put on that karma when we create it. I meaning me, the self, the individual. Then when we identify with another body in the future, that karma that we created in the past life can seek us out. It can find us. Why? Because it's my karma. It was done with my body. Each of us is a unique individual. It's like having a unique ID that karma can always find. Because we identify with the cause of karma, the activities, thoughts, and words that create our karma, we also identify with the results. And that means this body, the things that are related to this body, like my clothes, my hair, my food, my room, my house, my friends, my this, my that, etc., and so on. So all of them have that stamp of I and mine. And that is why they're all considered our karma. In other words, the body, the mind, and the other things with which we identify are the clinging aggregate of matter. Rupa-padana kandha. The Buddha says, monks, whatever matter, be it past, present, or future, internal or external, gross or fine, inferior or superior, far or near, is with cankers, has to do with clinging. That is called the clinging aggregate of matter. Rupapadana kanda. Kanda means aggregate. Rupa means form. Upadana means clinging. The matter that matters in the path is the matter that we identify with, the matter that we cling to, the matter we're attached to, the matter we consider me and mine. This is a very important definition of matter because it includes the individual, it includes consciousness, it includes intention. And after all, the reason that we're suffering, the reason why we're creating so much karma, the reason why we're so attached in this material world and we have to suffer in this material world is this intention. Intention, or fabrication, is the first stage of dependent origination after ignorance. We're ignorant. We don't know that what we're about to do is going to bind us to suffering. So we create an intention that let me enjoy this matter. Let me be this self. Let me have these things, and so on. It's because of these ignorant intentions, formed without understanding, that lead us into suffering and that cause all of our suffering to this very day. If you truly understand this process, if you really have the insight into how we create our suffering, then the path out of the suffering becomes clear and obvious. Western Buddhists always want like a checklist, like a recipe, cookbook process. But there is no cookbook process. The closest you can get to that is, as one of my teachers told me, whatever you have done, that you must undo. So how did we get here? Whatever we've done to get into this situation, now we have to back that out. It's not like meditation is a forward process where we're going someplace new. No, it's going back. It's walking backwards and undoing the things we did to get ourselves into this mess. So until next time, Buddha Saranai. May Buddha bless your life.